The decanter had been placed at her setting. That was the first thing Cecily Hartwell noticed when she took her chair at the long table in Ashmore House. Not the candles, not the silver, not the faces of the 14 guests arranged along the damask like a court awaiting judgment, but the decanter. A cut-glass vessel of deep garnet cordial, set close enough that the serving footman would naturally pour it for the lady at that chair and no other. She had seen it brought from the sideboard by a young footman who did not meet her eyes. She had seen whose hand had directed him, and she knew what was in it. She did not look at Roderick Vane. She looked instead at the candles. There were 11 of them in the central épergne, their flames very still in the sealed room, the light falling soft and equal across the faces of people who had decided, collectively and without much deliberation, that she was not worth looking at. She was the Hartwell charity case, as Lady Sylvia had said to her mother 3 hours earlier in the withdrawing room, the words carrying through a half-open door with the careless confidence of a woman who does not bother to lower her voice because she does not believe the subject of her observation has ears worth guarding against. The Hartwell charity case arrived in London on a dead man's last £100, hoping the season would produce what 23 years of plain, honest living had not: a husband, a future, a reason to remain. Cecily picked up the decanter. The room did not see her do it. Conversation moved around the table like water finding its level, and she was not part of the current. She poured a measure of the cordial into the small cut-glass cup beside her setting. She set the decanter down with the steadiness of a woman who has been afraid before, and knows that fear, properly managed, is not the same as defeat. She lifted the cup. She turned it in the candlelight. Then she looked at Roderick. He was watching her from his position 2 chairs down, and the particular quality of his attention, fixed and calibrated and waiting, told her everything she needed to know about what he expected to happen next. She smiled at him. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a woman who has already decided what she intends to do, and who knows that he does not yet understand it. "Mr. Vane," she said, her voice level in the sudden quiet that sometimes descends on a table between courses. "I believe this was decanted for me. Will you not have the first taste? I understand you selected it yourself." The room heard. Edmund Vane, Earl of Ashmore, at the head of the table, heard. She held the cup toward Roderick and waited. She had arrived in London 6 weeks earlier, on the 2nd Thursday of October, in a hired post-chaise that smelled of damp leather and someone else's journey. She had 2 trunks, one smaller than the other, and a letter of introduction from the family solicitor, Mr. Foss, addressed to Lady Marin Colwood, her mother's old school friend, who had agreed, out of what Cecily suspected was equal parts genuine kindness and social curiosity, to sponsor her through the season. She had £120 remaining from her father's small bequest. She had, in the reticule she carried everywhere, a small bottle of lavender water in pale blue glass, stopped with a cork, which her father had pressed into her hand on the last occasion she had seen him well. That occasion had been 3 years ago. She had not seen him again because Roderick had told him she had eloped. Not that she had considered it, not that she had spoken of it, but that she had done it. She had, Roderick told her father, run off with a dancing master from Cheltenham and disgraced the family, and could not be permitted contact with a man in frail health who deserved, at the last, to die in peace. Her father had believed it. He was a gentleman of modest intelligence and immense credulity, and Roderick was his solicitor's clerk at the time and therefore trusted, and Cecily had been in Bath, caring for her aunt, and therefore absent, and the lie had had 6 uncontested weeks in which to become fact. She had arrived home to find the funeral already 3 days past, and a letter waiting for her that began, "My dear Cecily," and ended, "I fear I have not always understood you." but I trust you are happy now, wherever you are." He had died believing she had chosen to leave him. He had died with Roderick at his bedside. The bequest was real enough. Roderick had not risked touching that, knowing it would be examined. The estate itself, the modest property in Wiltshire that had been in the Hartwell family for 60 years, had passed to Cecily conditional on her marrying within 18 months of her father's death. If she did not marry in time, it reverted to the male line. The nearest male relative was Roderick Vane, her father's cousin's son, who had been managing the property's accounts for the past 2 years, and who wanted it with the focused, methodical desire of a man who has been planning for something long enough that he has stopped thinking of it as wanting and started thinking of it as his. She had not known, when she arrived in London, that he intended to ensure she did not marry. She had known she did not trust him. She had not yet understood the shape of what he was willing to do. Lady Maren Colwood lived in a narrow house in Marylebone that was considerably better appointed than its exterior suggested, and she had received Cecily with a warmth that asked nothing and offered much. She was 61, childless, with bright eyes and a dry manner, and a habit of observing rooms from their corners that Cecily recognized and respected. She had told Cecily 3 things on the first evening: that the season was already half spent, and haste would be required, that a letter of introduction to Lady Ashmore would be arranged, and that the Earl of Ashmore was the kind of man one did not easily impress, but whose impression, once made, tended to hold. The letter had been written. The invitation to Ashmore House had arrived 10 days later, for a small evening gathering of 20, then reduced to a dinner of 14 when a previous engagement conflicted. Cecily had attended not knowing what to expect, and had found in the library before the other guests arrived a man standing at the window with his back to the room, his posture suggesting a stillness she associated with people who have decided what they feel and are not yet prepared to act on it. She had been looking for a book on Roman aqueducts, which she had begun researching because Lady Maren's nephew had asked her about them the previous week, and she had found herself unable to answer, and she considered ignorance on any subject addressable by a well-stocked library to be a small personal failure. She had not expected anyone else to be there. "The volume you want is on the 3rd shelf," the Earl of Ashmore said, without turning, "to the left of the green Cicero." She had found it exactly where he said. She had not yet thanked him when he turned, and what she saw in his face was not the expression she had been led to expect from Lady Maren's description of a cold and difficult man. It was the expression of someone who has been very alone for a long time and has made a reasonable peace with it, and is not certain, in this moment, that the peace is going to hold. "Miss Hartwell," he said. He had been told her name, presumably from the dinner list. "You came early." "Lady Maren's driver was punctual," she said. "I did not like to keep him waiting in the cold." He looked at her for a moment. "Come in, then," he said, as though she were not already in. And then he turned back to the window, and she took a chair and read about aqueducts until the other guests arrived. And the quiet between them was, she thought, the most comfortable quiet she had sat in since her father died. He had a son, Thomas, 8 years old, who appeared in the doorway of the library 10 minutes after Cecily had taken her chair, drawn by some instinct for adult company that 8-year-old boys occasionally develop when they are lonely. The Earl turned from the window when Thomas came in and said, with a gentleness that surprised her after the formality of his address, "You are supposed to be at supper with Mrs. Prine." "Mrs. Prine fell asleep," Thomas said. "Then go back and sit quietly until she wakes." "I would rather sit here." The Earl looked at his son for a moment with the expression of a man who knows he is going to concede and is calculating the cost. He glanced at Cecily. "Miss Hartwell was kind enough to accept the library's hospitality," he said, "and will not be grateful for additional interruptions." "I do not mind," Cecily said, which was true, and Thomas came into the room and sat cross-legged beside her chair and looked at the book about aqueducts with the frank curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to pretend indifference. She showed him the diagrams. The Earl watched from the window for several minutes before he returned to whatever he had been contemplating, and the room was quiet, and Thomas asked why the Romans had bothered building something so elaborate just to move water, and Cecily said she rather thought the question was not why they bothered, but what they believed they were capable of, which was a different kind of question entirely. And the Earl, still at the window, went very still. The evening had gone less quietly after that. Lady Sylvia Pembroke had arrived on her mother's arm and had arranged herself at the drawing-room's best angle before Cecily had managed to cross the threshold from the hall. And the first thing Cecily had heard was Lady Sylvia saying to her mother, in a voice calibrated to carry exactly far enough, "Is that the Hartwell charity case? She looks precisely as I expected." Cecily had not altered her expression. She had continued across the room and accepted a glass of lemonade from a footman, and positioned herself near the fire where the light was good, and she could see the whole room, and she had noted which guests moved toward Lady Sylvia, and which moved toward the Earl, and which moved toward no one in particular. And she had filed the information away with the careful efficiency of a woman who has never had the luxury of ignoring her social landscape. Roderick had arrived last, and when he saw her, his face had gone through something that was not quite surprise and not quite calculation, but was the particular blankness of a man who has encountered a variable he thought he had managed. He had recovered in under 2 seconds. He had crossed the room and kissed her hand with all the warmth of a man who has nothing to hide, and said, "Cousin Cecily, I had not known you would be here." "Lady Marin's invitation came through Lord Ashmore's office," she said pleasantly. "I understood it was open to any of her acquaintance." "Of course," he said. "Of course." He had seated himself across the room from her, and she had watched him through the evening, watching her. And she had seen the moment he noticed the cordial decanter and the moment he spoke to the footman. And she had understood. She watched him for the next several days. Not conspicuously. She had learned, in the years since her father's death, that surveillance conducted with visible intensity was surveillance that announced itself, and she could not afford to announce herself to Roderick before she understood precisely what he was planning. She attended the 2 morning calls that Lady Marin arranged, and an afternoon card party in Portman Square, and a musicale at which the younger Miss Fenwick played the pianoforte with considerable feeling and very little accuracy. And at each of these occasions, Roderick appeared, or did not appear, in ways she began to map. He appeared at the card party. He did not approach her directly, but positioned himself at a table close enough to observe her conversations, and twice she looked up to find his gaze on her with the quality of a man estimating a distance. He spoke to Lady Fenwick, who hosted the musicale, for several minutes in a window embrasure, and afterward Lady Fenwick looked at Cecily with a new coolness she had not shown before, and Cecily understood that whatever Roderick had said, it had been enough to move a needle. He came to call on Lady Marin's house on a Tuesday morning, which was irregular and unannounced, and when Cecily came downstairs to find him in the small sitting room, he rose with the ease of a man entirely comfortable in rooms that are not his. "Cousin," he said, "you look well. London agrees with you. Lady Marin is hospitable," she said. He said nothing for a moment, turning his hat in his hands in a way that was not quite fidgeting and not quite ease. "I understand you have been received at Ashmore House," he said. An impressive connection. "Lord Ashmore was kind," she said. "He is known to be selective," Roderick said. One wonders what drew his attention. He paused. Do be careful, cousin. A man in his position receives a great many young women in straitened circumstances, and not all of them have understood the difference between generosity and interest. He smiled, and the smile was perfectly calibrated. I would not wish to see you mistaken about his intentions. Your concern is noted, she said, and kept her voice pleasant, because pleasantness in such moments is not weakness, but armor, and she had been wearing it for 3 years. He left within 10 minutes. She sat with the information for some time, testing its edges. He was afraid that the Earl's attention would produce an offer, and that if it produced an offer, she would accept it, and that her marriage would close the entails window and take the property out of his reach. He was not merely inconveniencing her. He was timing something. At the Pemberton gathering the following week, she overheard him telling Lord Whitmore's wife that Miss Hartwell's father had died deeply in debt, that the little bequest she had come to London on was borrowed money, and that however kind her connection with Lady Maren might be, one would not want one's son seriously engaged with the Hartwell charity case. Lord Whitmore's wife listened with the attentive interest of a woman who collects such information professionally, and Cecily stood on the other side of a painted screen and felt the phrase settle over her the way cold water settles. Precisely and completely. The Hartwell charity case. The second time she had heard it used about her, and the first time she had heard Roderick say it, and the particular intimacy of hearing one's own reduction in a man's mouth who had smiled at her that morning in a borrowed sitting room, was a thing she could not have described adequately to anyone who had not experienced it. She stood behind the screen for approximately 30 seconds. Then she walked around it and across the room to the window seat and took a glass of lemonade from a passing footman and resumed the conversation she had been having with Miss Pemberton about the improvements Lady Maren intended for her Marylebone garden in spring, and she was, to all visible evidence, entirely unaffected. She had been afraid. She would not have been honest if she had said otherwise. The fear had clarified rather than paralyzed her, which was a quality she had developed over 3 years of managing alone, and she had made her decision by the time the first course was served. The discovery had not been dramatic. It had been, in fact, rather procedural. She had arrived early to the private sitting room off the dining room, where several decanters had been assembled on a side table for the footman to arrange, and she had noticed the garnet cordial did not smell as cordials should smell. It had a sharpness underneath the sweetness, faint but present, the way certain compounds smell when they are dissolved in something intended to conceal them. She had recognized it because her Aunt Phryne had kept a bottle of similar preparation for her neuralgia. The kind of bottle one kept locked in a cabinet and dispensed in careful measured drops, not in measures of cordial, not in quantities that would be poured without thought into a cup by a young woman who was thirsty and cold and not yet comfortable enough in Ashmore House to ask for something different. She had poured the cup. She had held it. She had thought of her father, alone in Wiltshire, dying with a letter in his hand from a daughter he believed had chosen to leave him. And she had thought of Roderick at his bedside, and she had thought of Thomas asking why the Romans bothered, and she had thought of what she believed she was capable of. If you have stayed with this story until now, I want you to know what she had already decided. She had decided she would not die quietly in Roderick's story. She had decided she would choose the arena and the moment, and that the moment would be witnessed, and that whatever came next, she would have acted from her own understanding of what was right, rather than from fear of what was wrong. She had carried the cup into the dining room. She had taken her chair. She had waited. The Earl was watching her from the head of the table. She had been aware of him all evening, in the way one is aware of a specific quality of light in a room without being able to say exactly where it is coming from. a warmth at the edge of perception that does not demand attention, but is there if one turns toward it. He had seated her at his right, which Lady Sylvia had noted with a precision that suggested she had been expecting to occupy that seat herself. He had not said much to Cecily directly, but he had twice redirected conversation that was moving toward the kind of social flaying that the season excelled at producing, each redirection so smoothly accomplished that it was only afterward, replaying the exchange, that one understood what had happened. She had understood in the moment. She had also heard Lord Whitmore's wife, in the first minutes of the gathering before dinner, say to Lady Sylvia in a low voice near the fireplace, "She is the Hartwell charity case, you know. Her cousin says the father left nothing but a little bequest and a deal of sentiment." Lady Sylvia had smiled. The smile had been the smile of a woman who has just received information that confirms her existing opinion, and therefore does not interest her much. "Yes," she had said. "I know. 3 times now. 3 separate rooms, 3 separate mouths, the same reduction, reliable as a clock." Cecily had folded the information and placed it where she placed all such things. In the part of herself that kept accounts, that remembered costs and calculated what they were for, and what, eventually, would close them. He said now, from the head of the table, into the quiet that had opened around her words to Roderick, "Mr. Vane." It was 2 words. The room went entirely still. Roderick looked at the Earl. He looked at the cup. He looked at Cecily. He said, with a lightness that was almost masterful, "A charming notion, cousin. But I confess I have no taste for cordial this evening." "You selected it yourself," Cecily said again. Her voice was very steady. "You directed the footman specifically to this decanter. I wonder that you would go to such particular trouble for a cordial you do not intend to drink. The room had the quality of a room in which people have stopped breathing without yet understanding why." Lord Whitmore's wife, seated 4 chairs down, said very quietly to her neighbor, "What is she doing?" The question was not unkind. It was the question of a woman who was watching something she did not yet have a name for. "Miss Hartwell," said the Earl, and his voice had the quality of a man who is speaking with great deliberate care. "Set the cup down, if you please." She set it down. "Mr. Foss," said the Earl without raising his voice, and the family solicitor, who had been seated at the far end of the table at the Earl's prior arrangement, and who had arrived that evening carrying a leather satchel that he had surrendered to the butler with the murmur that the Earl had requested certain documents, said, "Yes, my lord." "Tell the room what you told me this afternoon," the Earl said. Mr. Fossey set down his fork. He was 64. With the bearing of a man who has spent 40 years witnessing what people are willing to do for property, and he was not visibly surprised. "The cordial in that decanter was brought to my office this morning," he said, "by a young woman who had been employed to deliver it. She did not know what it contained. She had been paid to bring it and say nothing. I engaged the services of a physician who is known to me. The preparation contains a compound of white hellebore in a concentration sufficient to produce, in a person of Miss Hartwell's slight frame, symptoms that would present as a sudden and acute episode of the kind that does not always permit recovery." The word hellebore landed on the table like a stone. "I engaged Mr. Fossey 2 days ago," the Earl said, "when I received word from Mrs. Aldgate, who had been Miss Hartwell's father's housekeeper before his death, and who had reason to observe Mr. Vane's management of the Hartwell accounts, that she wished to speak to a solicitor, and did not know how to reach one who was not already in Mr. Vane's sphere. I gave her Mr. Fossey's direction." He looked at Roderick. His face was very still. "The decanter was sourced to you, Mr. Vane. The payment was traced to an account in your name at Hoar's. You will have the opportunity to offer a different account of these facts to the appropriate authorities. You will not offer it at my table." Roderick's face had gone the color of the damask. Lady Sylvia, across the table, looked at him, and what moved across her expression was not quite horror and not quite recognition, but the particular settling that comes over a person when they understand that they have been associating themselves, publicly and deliberately, with the wrong side of a room. "Miss Hartwell," the Earl said, and he rose from his chair, and the room rose with him, because rooms do that, and he crossed to her end of the table, not in haste, not with any quality of performance, but with the measured deliberateness of a man who has decided something and is carrying it out. He removed the cup from in front of her and gave it to the footman standing nearest and said, quietly, "Take it to Mr. Foss." Then he looked at her. The room was watching. "She is the only woman in this room I trust," he said. 10 words. No decoration. His eyes did not leave her face. She was aware of her hands in her lap. She was aware of the lavender bottle in her reticule at her feet. She was aware that the room was waiting for her to say something, and that whatever she said would be the sentence around which this evening would be arranged in memory for years by everyone present. And she said nothing at all, because the expression on his face had made speech unnecessary, and she had learned that the most important things do not require words to be understood. Roderick left the room within 3 minutes, escorted by 2 men the Earl indicated with a glance. He did not speak. He did not look at Cecily again. Mr. Fossey remained, his satchel retrieved from the butler, his documents laid ready for the signatures that would need to be witnessed before the evening was entirely over. The dinner continued. Lord Whitmore told a story about a horse he had owned in his youth, and Lady Sylvia ate her pheasant with the focused attention of a woman recalibrating her entire understanding of the situation. And Thomas appeared once more in the doorway of the dining room, drawn again by something he could not have named, and the Earl looked at him and said, with that same quiet gentleness, "Mrs. Prine is looking for you." And Thomas went, but not before catching Cecily's eye with the frank conspiratorial look of a child who knows something important has happened and is not sure what. Afterward, when the guests had gone and Mr. Fossey had taken his documents and made his farewells, and the candles had burned to stubs in the épergne, the Earl came to where Cecily was standing in the hall, waiting for Lady Marin's carriage, and he stood close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the cold hallway. And he said, "You knew what was in the cup when you arrived at the table." "I did," she said, "and you had decided what you intended to do before the soup was served." "Before the invitations were sent," she said, "once I understood the situation fully." He was quiet for a moment. The carriage had not yet appeared. The candle in the hall sconce guttered slightly in some distant movement of air. "He told your father you had eloped," he said. It was not a question. Mr. Fossey had included this information in his afternoon account. "Yes," she said, "and your father died believing it." "He did." "I had a letter," he said, and his voice changed in a way she would not have been able to describe, going lower and more careful. The voice of a man touching something he has kept in darkness for a long time. "From my wife. Written in her last days. I have not opened it because I was afraid of what she said about the weeks I was absent from the house." He put his hand to his breast pocket, a gesture so habitual she could see it was automatic, done without thought. "I have carried it 3 years without opening it." She looked at him. He was 34 years old, and he had the face of a man who had decided to be alone and had not yet found a reason good enough to reverse the decision. "Mr. Fossey," she said gently, "told me that Lady Ashmore asked for paper and ink on the last morning, and wrote for some time. He said the attending physician told him she had seemed at peace afterward. She paused. "I do not know what is in the letter, my lord. I do not think a woman at peace writes something intended to wound." He was very still. "Open it," she said. "Whatever it says, you deserve to know." The carriage appeared in the square outside, the horse's breath visible in the cold October air. She picked up her reticule. She felt against her hip through the bag's thin fabric, the small, hard cylinder of the lavender bottle, her father's last gift, which she had carried every day since he died as a kind of argument against despair. "Miss Hartwell," he said. She turned. He was looking at her with an expression she had seen only once before, in her father's face on the morning she had left for Bath, which was the expression of a person who is watching someone they love go away and has not yet found the words to ask them to stay. "Come back tomorrow," he said, which was, from him, the equivalent of a declaration, and she understood it as such. She was aware, as she said yes, of her own pulse, of the specific temperature of the hallway, of the single candle still burning in the sconce above his shoulder. She was aware that his hand had not moved from where it had been for the last several minutes, not reaching toward her and not retreating, simply present. And that presence had a weight she could feel from a foot away, the way one feels the heat of a fire before one is close enough to see the flames. This was what her wound had told her would not come. This particular quality of being seen, without performance or display, in the cold, practical facts of who she was and what she had done. Her wound had been wrong. She had always known it might be wrong. She had not been prepared for how much the wrongness would feel like being given back something she had been carrying alone for 3 years. "Yes," she said. The carriage moved through the dark streets of London, and the season shifted on its axis as seasons do, slowly and without announcement, and Cecily held the lavender bottle through the fabric of her reticule and thought of her father, who had believed the worst because he had not known to doubt the source, and thought of Elspeth Vane, who had died in peace and had written something on her last morning, and thought of Thomas, asking why the Romans bothered. And she knew the answer better now than she had when she first gave it. It is not why you bother. It is what you believe yourself capable of. The weeks that followed were, in their way, quieter than anything that had come before. Roderick's situation was managed through the proper channels, the way such situations were managed in that period, with solicitors and affidavits and the particular procedural machinery of a society that preferred its scandals contained. He did not contest the evidence. He withdrew from London by the end of October and was not seen in the season's remaining gatherings, which was consequence enough and more than he had counted on when he had selected the decanter. The Wiltshire property was confirmed for Cecily by the same mechanism that would have stripped it from her if she had died that evening. Mr. Fawcett produced documentation showing the entail's conditions, the Earl's formal testimony about the evening's events, and the physician's analysis of the compound. The property was hers, held in trust by Mr. Fawcett until such time as she chose to dispose of it as she saw fit. She did not visit it immediately. There was too much still happening in London. She came back to Ashmore House the next morning, as she had said she would, and found the Earl in the library again, at the same window, and on the reading table beside his chair. There was a letter, opened, its pages refolded and set flat. He did not speak about it directly when she came in, but he did not conceal it. And his face was different, lighter in a way that had nothing to do with the morning sun through the window, and she did not ask him what it said because some things are answered by looking and not by asking. He opened the Roman aqueduct book to the page with the diagram she had shown Thomas and set it on the table between them, and they talked about what people believed themselves capable of, which was a subject neither of them had expected to return to, but which turned out to be the subject they had always been talking about. and Thomas came down before his lessons and sat cross-legged on the floor and listened with the alert, solemn attention of a child who understands that something important is happening in this room. By November, the nature of the Earl's attention had stopped being deniable to anyone, including the Earl. By December, it had stopped being deniable to Cecily, who had been managing her own awareness of it with the disciplined suppression she had been applying to inconvenient truths for most of her adult life, and who found, one afternoon in the library when he said her name, her given name, Cecily, for the first time and with no title before it, that suppression had finally exhausted itself. She looked at him. He was standing very close. Close enough that she was aware of his breathing. "I want to tell you something," he said. And his voice was level in the way that very controlled people speak, when they are not controlling themselves as successfully as they appear to be. "I do not know the right way to say it." "You are better than you think," she said quietly, "at saying the things that matter." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he put his hand over hers, on the spine of the book she was holding, his fingers covering hers in a warmth she had been aware of, from a careful distance, for months. "I opened the letter," he said. She wrote that she was not angry, that she had understood before the end that the weeks I was absent were the weeks the treaty debate was decided, and that she had known, when she married me, that I would always believe I owed the country something of myself, and that she did not regret being the wife of a man who felt that debt. He paused. She said she wished me a long life, and someone in it worth staying home for. Cecily did not say anything. "I think she would have liked you," he said. She turned her hand under his, slowly, so that her palm was against his palm, and his fingers closed around her hand with the careful, deliberate care of a man who knows he is holding something that matters. They stood like that for a moment in the afternoon light, the fire crackling at the hearth, snow beginning outside the window, the book still between them. It was not the most dramatic moment of her story. It was not the candle-lit dinner with a room of 14 watching, or the cup held steady in her hand, or Roderick's face going blank and then white. It was a library in December, and a hand in hers, and a name said quietly, and it was enough. It was more than enough. They were married in January, in the small church 3 streets from Lady Marin's house, with Thomas as witness and Mr. Fossey as procedural authority, and Mrs. Aldgate in the 3rd pew, wearing her best wool bonnet and weeping without apology. Lady Marin kissed Cecily's cheek in the vestibule afterward and said, "Your mother would have found this entirely satisfactory," which was, from Lady Marin, a considerable compliment. That evening, in the drawing room at Ashmore House, which was Cecily's house now, her house in the specific and deliberate sense that it had been named so in front of witnesses and recorded in the proper registers, she sat beside the fire with Thomas on the floor at her feet, his back against her chair, reading aloud from a book about Roman engineering that he had selected himself. The snow had continued through the afternoon and lay now in the square outside the window, covering the stone and the iron railings and the bare November trees in a quiet that made the city feel, briefly, like a countryside. The Earl came in from the study with the look of a man who has completed something and is glad to be in a room where he does not need to complete anything else. And he sat in the chair opposite, and the fire moved between them, and Thomas read about aqueducts. On the table beside Cecily's chair was the small blue glass bottle of lavender water, unstoppered now, its scent moving in the warm air of the room. It had been a long time since she had been able to smell it without grief. She could now. She had placed it on the table that morning, because some things are meant to be let out of the dark. Thomas looked up from the page. "She says it is not why you bother," he said to his father. "It is what you believe yourself capable of." The Earl looked at Cecily. His face was quiet and warm in the firelight, and she thought she could see, in the particular steadiness of his expression, all the things he had decided to be capable of, and all the things he had not yet tried. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly right." The fire settled. The snow continued. The bottle of lavender water stood in the warm air, and the room held everything it had been built, slowly and at considerable cost, to hold, and it was home, and it was enough, and the evening asked nothing further of either of them than this. If her father's story had ended in Roderick's hands, she would have been a name in a will, a footnote, a reason a piece of land changed hands. She had not permitted that ending. She had poured the cup and held it and looked her betrayer in the eye, and what she had discovered in that moment, in the steady weight of it, was that she had never been what Roderick's story said she was, and she had always known it, and she had waited, with patience she had not chosen, but had developed out of necessity, for the room that would prove it. That room had had 11 candles and a man at its head who had seen her from the beginning. Thank you for staying with Cecily until the end. If her story moved you, leave a note in the comments. She would have wanted to know she was not the only one who believed in being capable of more.